Mr. Rawley, we had just a couple of questions for you regarding if we could start with the AHLC meeting that was held yesterday. Could you perhaps explain to us how the AHLC is related, or if it is related, to the loss assessment and the reconstruction of Gaza?
Sure. Well, the AHLC, as you know, these are meetings that have been going on for 20 years, and they're held typically twice a year. And the overall objective is to look at the macroeconomic situation of Palestine, which obviously is both West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, and to see what the situation is and what additional funding is required for the Palestinian budget. Now, obviously, each AHLC has a specific theme. The overriding theme of this AHLC was Gaza, but the focus was not only on Gaza.
Okay, so maybe we can talk then about the upcoming donor conference that will take place in Cairo on October 12th. How do you see that playing out? I guess the loss assessment will be a major centerpiece of that conference. What would your expectations be regarding international support for the reconstruction of Gaza?
Well, I would hope that it would be very generous. I think anyone who's been to Gaza, and I've been there 6 times since July, walks away absolutely shocked, not only by the scale of human suffering, and we're all familiar with that the 2,100 Palestinians who were killed, the 11,000 wounded, including 1,000 very seriously, the 500 children dead, but the scale of physical destruction, it far exceeds Operation Cast Lead by a factor of 3 or 4. There are parts of Gaza that look like they were hit by an earthquake. So there's tremendous need for international funding to try and contribute to something that's even more far-reaching than the reconstruction of Gaza. The objective is to allow the people of Gaza to enjoy a normal life in which all their rights are respected. So it is about building back what was destroyed in July and August. It's also about addressing the underlying development issues that have plagued Gaza for the last 10 years. Here I refer to the really appalling situation in terms of energy, the danger to the water supply, and also governance issues. You know, we have to use this conference as an opportunity to raise funds for a rationalization of the public sector in such a way that people that are working get paid, but at the same time, we're working towards an integration of the ministries of the Palestinian Authority. So I'm hoping that the international community will be generous in contributing to what I would call not only the reconstruction of Gaza, but the normalization of Gaza so the people of Gaza have a decent life.
Yes, it's a tall agenda for this year for sure. I mean, in your discussions with the international community over the last couple of months, what's your sense? Do you sense that they are receptive to looking and analyzing and supporting on these issues in all ways, from the humanitarian perspective, from the, as you say, the governance perspective, from the political perspective?
Yeah, that's okay. The response on the humanitarian side is quite good so far, but particularly for UNRWA. And that's very important because, as you know, roughly 2/3 of the residents of Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees. However, we have a lot of humanitarian needs, including shelter for the non-refugee population, water and sanitation, psychosocial support that is terribly underfunded at this point. And we are appealing to the international community, and I'm actually flying to Brussels and Geneva at the end of this week to increase the support for humanitarian work. Now, in terms of recovery and reconstruction, you know, the economies of many of the donor countries are not the best, and there's a lot of there are other needs out there ranging from Ebola fever to the situation elsewhere in the Middle East. However, I do think that the international community is not only impressed by the level of destruction and the need to respond, but also the fact that the government of the state of Palestine and the Israeli government have agreed on a mechanism will allow much larger volume of dual-use materials to go into Gaza to facilitate reconstruction, I think that will encourage the international community to pledge funds, because there's much higher level of assurance that that funding will actually translate into projects on the ground in Gaza.
You mentioned something that begs a couple of issues. One being, has there been a solid agreement regarding those material inputs to reconstruction?
Well, there's a solid agreement between the State of Palestine and the government of Israel that the UN brokered. Now what we have to do is take this agreement, which is a number of pages long, and translate it into a whole monitoring mechanism. We're working on that. Basically what has to be done is a database has to be set up to track materials, and we also have to train people to carry out spot monitoring in Gaza. These are all doable tasks, but they will take, it'll take a few weeks to stand up this system. But we certainly have the political agreement between the parties to undertake this, and we're moving ahead with setting up the mechanism or the support to the mechanism so that indeed we can bring in a much higher level of dual-use materials into Gaza.
All right, so we've spoken about the money required to do the reconstruction, and we've spoken as well about the material inputs. Who would you see kind of taking the lead on the reconstruction effort?
Yeah, that's a good question. The lead should be taken by the government of the State of Palestine, the government of national consensus, and very much by the private sector. The government will have to be very much involved, in fact, take the lead in terms of this monitoring mechanism. The UN is helping set up the database, and the UN will also be involved partially in terms of the monitoring, but the government has to very much take the lead on the mechanism, putting the people in place and making sure the system runs. The private sector also has to take a leading role, and here, this, to the extent that we have higher level of materials going into Gaza, the private sector will benefit. Both the private sector in Gaza, in terms of supplying materials and being contracted for works, as well as the private sector on the West Bank that can provide material to go into Gaza. So this should be a boost in the arm to the private sector, the Palestinian private sector.
All right, I have two short questions for you because I know your time is wrapping up. One being, is there a role, as was reported earlier in the week, for UN observers or supporters on the ground to kind of smooth over some of the implementation issues in Gaza?
Well, I saw that report. I think the numbers are a bit high. There certainly will be teams that will be going out doing sample monitoring. We're looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of small-scale works. The neighbor down the block whose house was damaged, who has to repair it, plus large-scale reconstruction. There will be sample monitoring of these works as part of the system. That will be done primarily by our Palestinian colleagues working for the UN and also officials from government ministries. There is a monitoring committee that will be set up consisting of Palestinians, Israelis, and the UN that will meet periodically every month, every 2 months, to basically follow the mechanism and make any adjustments that have to take place. So that also will be put in place.
Okay, let me ask you just this one question in closing regarding the private sector, because, of course, this has been a very tricky area for the humanitarian community to tackle. They don't normally consider the private sector as being humanitarian. In Gaza, the private sector employs up to 30% of the employable population. But how do you see, will there be support in one way or another coming to the private sector, especially those who have lost assets in the last war? How do you see the integration of the private sector into this whole reconstruction and recovery phase? Okay, well, I think on two levels. First of all, to the extent that private enterprises haven't been destroyed, they've only been damaged or untouched. There will be, there should be a lot of job opportunities. So, that's one way that they'll recover by working. Okay, working on the reconstruction of Gaza. Now,
There also, and I met with His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister Mohammed Mustafa yesterday, I understand that as part of a damage and needs assessment that will be taking place following the conference, there will be special attention to the industrial sector of Gaza, including those enterprises that have been damaged or destroyed. So I do understand that there is some special attention that will be paid to the private sector. But again, a lot of getting the private sector back up to speed is giving them job opportunities, and the reconstruction of Gaza should certainly afford that opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. Well, listen, Mr. Rawley, thank you very much for your time this morning. A very interesting comment on the situation current and upcoming. And we'll look forward to seeing you in cluster meetings.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye now.